Story 1. Whispers in the Empty House. In the heart of a remote forest, where tall pine trees stood sentinel and a winding dirt road led to nowhere, there sat an isolated cottage. It was a quaint, centuries-old structure that had withstood the test of time, its time-worn charm and rustic appearance drawing those who sought solitude and escape from the chaos of the world. Emily, a young writer with an insatiable thirst for adventure, had stumbled upon the cottage while researching her latest novel. It was a place where the outside world seemed to fade into oblivion, and the silence was deafening. Intrigued by its isolation and the promise of uninterrupted creativity, she had decided to spend a month there alone, seeking inspiration in the solitude of the forest. Emily arrived at the cottage on a cloudy afternoon, her car crunching along the gravel road as she approached the weathered structure. The cottage was small, with ivy creeping up its stone walls, and the forest loomed in the distance like an ancient guardian. As she stepped inside, a sense of tranquility washed over her. The interior was charmingly rustic, with wooden beams overhead and an old fireplace that beckoned with the promise of warmth. A sense of freedom and possibility filled Emily's heart as she unpacked her belongings, eager to begin her writing retreat. But as night fell and the forest enveloped the cottage in darkness, Emily couldn't shake a growing unease. The isolation that had drawn her here suddenly felt suffocating, and the silence seemed to stretch on endlessly. She tried to shake off her fears, chalking them up to her overactive imagination. The days passed, and Emily settled into a routine of writing during the daylight hours and exploring the forest that surrounded the cottage. The tall pine trees whispered ancient secrets, and the rustling leaves seemed to offer a comforting embrace. Yet, as night descended upon the cottage, a palpable sense of dread gripped Emily. She heard strange noises in the darkness, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the windows and a faint whispering that seemed to emanate from the very walls. She dismissed them as tricks of the mind, attributing them to the isolation and the eerie stillness of the forest at night. One evening, as Emily sat at her writing desk, the tapping against the window grew louder, more insistent. She approached the window cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as she glimpsed a shadowy figure outside, a silhouette that seemed to watch her with unseen eyes. Panicked, she drew the curtains shut and locked all the doors and windows. The inexplicable events within the cottage only intensified. Emily's nights became plagued by restless dreams, vivid nightmares that left her in a cold sweat. She heard voices in the darkness, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls and carried promises of secrets waiting to be uncovered. One night, as Emily lay in bed, she felt the weight of an unseen presence in the room. She could barely make out the form of a figure standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes empty voids that seemed to draw her in. She screamed, but the figure vanished, leaving her trembling in terror. Desperate for answers, Emily delved into the history of the cottage, scouring old journals and newspaper clippings. She discovered that the cottage had once belonged to a reclusive author who had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind a legacy of tales of hauntings and strange occurrences. The cottage seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy that refused to be ignored. Furniture moved of its own accord, objects vanished only to reappear in strange places, and eerie apparitions flickered in the corners of Emily's vision. The whispers grew more distinct, as though a chorus of unseen voices surrounded her. They spoke of suffering, of betrayal, and of a malevolent presence that sought to claim the cottage as its own. Emily realized that she was not alone, that something, or someone, lingered within the cottage's time-worn walls. One night, as she sat by the fireplace, the flames suddenly flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew cold, and Emily heard the soft, echoing footsteps of someone, or something, approaching her. As the malevolent force within the cottage tightened its grip, Emily's sanity began to unravel. She felt as though she was being watched constantly, and the whispers that filled her mind grew louder and more insistent. Desperate to escape the torment, Emily ventured into the forest that surrounded the cottage. She hoped that the natural beauty and tranquility of the woods would provide solace, but she soon realized that the forest held its own secrets, a haunting presence that seemed to mirror the one within the cottage. Emily's days became a blur of fear and confusion, and she could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmares that plagued her. The isolation that had once seemed appealing had become a prison from which she could not escape. Determined to uncover the truth and free herself from the malevolent force that held her captive, Emily returned to the cottage. She confronted the entity that haunted her, demanding answers and release from its torment. One fateful night, as Emily stood in the dimly lit living room, the malevolent presence manifested before her, an ethereal figure shrouded in darkness. It spoke through her, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the cottage. It revealed its name, Erebus, and its insatiable hunger for souls. Emily, her resolve unshaken, refused to yield to Erebus's malevolence. With a fierce determination, she challenged the entity, demanding that it release its grip on the cottage and her mind. The walls seemed to tremble, and the air crackled with an otherworldly energy. A battle of wills unfolded within the cottage, a clash between the malevolent force of Erebus and the strength of Emily's determination. The very foundation of the cottage seemed to quake, and the shadows that had haunted her retreated. With a final, defiant cry, Emily banished Erebus from the cottage, her voice resonating with power. The entity screamed in anguish as it was forced to release its hold on the cottage and Emily's mind. Exhausted and shaken, Emily emerged from the cottage, her heart heavy with the weight of the past. She knew that the cottage would forever bear the scars of its history, but perhaps, with Erebus banished, it could find a measure of redemption. As she looked back at the cottage one last time, Emily saw a faint glimmer of light within its darkened windows. It was as though the cottage itself acknowledged her efforts and offered a silent gratitude for the release from its haunted legacy. Story 2. The Haunting of Hawthorne House. Nestled in the heart of a dense, ancient forest, Hawthorne House stood as a secluded retreat, far removed from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. The house was a grand, weathered mansion with a storied past, known for its picturesque surroundings and the promise of serenity it offered to those who sought refuge within its walls. Sophia, a successful architect in search of inspiration for her next project, had discovered Hawthorne House while on a solitary road trip. Its remote location and timeless beauty had drawn her in, and she decided to spend a month there, hoping the isolation would rekindle her creative spirit. Sophia arrived at Hawthorne House on a misty afternoon, her car winding through the dense forest until the mansion emerged like a forgotten relic. The house was an imposing structure, its grandeur evident even in its state of disrepair. Ivy clung to its stone walls, and the gardens had overgrown, reclaiming the land. As Sophia stepped inside, she was immediately struck by the mansion's faded opulence. The interior was filled with antique furniture, dust-covered chandeliers, and the lingering scent of old books. A sense of timelessness and solitude enveloped her, and she couldn't help but feel a shiver of unease. That first night, as Sophia lay in her antique bed, the solitude of Hawthorne House seemed to press down upon her. The creaking of the old wood, the distant hooting of an owl, and the vast silence of the forest beyond her window created an eerie symphony that made sleep elusive. Sophia spent her days exploring the vast forest that surrounded Hawthorne House, sketching the ancient trees and absorbing the tranquil atmosphere. But as night fell, a sense of unease settled in. She heard strange noises, rustling in the underbrush, faint whispers carried by the wind, and an eerie, mournful melody that seemed to drift through the air. One evening, as Sophia returned to the mansion after a day of exploration, she noticed something unsettling, a shadowy figure moving in the darkness outside her window. Panic gripped her as she glimpsed a face, twisted with anguish, peering in at her. She quickly closed the curtains, trembling with fear. Sophia convinced herself that it was a trick of her imagination, a result of the isolation and the eerie quiet of the forest. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone in Hawthorne House. One night, as she stood in the moonlit hallway, Olivia heard a mournful violin melody echoing through the cottage. The music was hauntingly beautiful, its notes filled with sorrow and longing. She followed the ethereal sound, her heart pounding with anticipation. The music held the inexplicable events within Hawthorne House only intensified. Sophia's nights became restless, haunted by vivid nightmares and the feeling of being watched. She noticed objects moving of their own accord, and her sketches were marred by strange, ghostly figures that appeared on the paper. Sophia began to hear voices in the dead of night, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. They spoke of pain, longing, and a malevolent presence that dwelled within Hawthorne House. Terrified, she started researching the history of the mansion, uncovering stories of a tragic love affair that had ended in despair. One night, as she stood in the moonlit hallway, Sophia heard a mournful violin melody echoing through the mansion. The music was hauntingly beautiful, its notes filled with sorrow and longing. She followed the ethereal sound, her heart pounding with anticipation. The music led her to a grand ballroom, where a spectral figure stood at a grand piano, her fingers gliding gracefully over the keys. It was a woman in a tattered, white gown, her eyes vacant and filled with sadness. Sophia tried to communicate with her, but the woman remained silent, lost in her haunting melody. As Sophia continued her exploration of Hawthorne House, she encountered more unexplainable phenomena. Lights flickered and dimmed inexplicably, and eerie apparitions appeared in the moonlit corridors. The whispers that had haunted her grew more distinct, as if a chorus of unseen voices surrounded her. She delved deeper into the mansion's history, uncovering the tragic tale of Eleanor, a woman who had been torn apart by a forbidden love. It was said that her spirit still lingered within Hawthorne House, trapped by her unfulfilled desires and the malevolent force that bound her. Sophia's nights grew increasingly tumultuous as she struggled to understand the darkness that enveloped the mansion. She realized that she was not alone. Eleanor's tormented spirit, and the malevolent entity that held her captive, sought to draw her into their tragic story. Determined to confront the malevolent entity and free herself from the grip of Hawthorne House, Sophia ventured into the heart of the mansion. She called out to Eleanor, acknowledging her pain and the tragic love that had bound her spirit. One night, as Sophia stood in the dimly lit grand ballroom, the malevolent presence manifested before her, an ethereal figure shrouded in darkness. It spoke through her, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the mansion. It revealed its name, Selim, and its insatiable hunger for souls. Sophia, her resolve unshaken, refused to yield to Selim's malevolence. With a fierce determination, she challenged the entity, demanding that it release Eleanor's spirit and free Hawthorne House from its dark influence. The walls seemed to tremble, and the air crackled with an otherworldly energy. A battle of wills unfolded within Hawthorne House, a clash between the malevolent force of Selim and the strength of Sophia's determination. The very foundation of the mansion seemed to quake, and the shadows that had haunted her retreated. With a final, defiant cry, Sophia banished Selim from Hawthorne House, her voice resonating with power. The entity screamed in anguish as it was forced to release Eleanor's spirit, and the mansion itself seemed to sigh with relief. Story 3. The Haunting of Willowbrook Cottage. Nestled on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, Willowbrook Cottage stood as an enigma amidst a sea of meadows and ancient woods. The cottage was a charming, centuries-old structure, its whitewashed walls and thatched roof lending it an air of rustic simplicity. But beneath its quaint exterior lay a history fraught with mysteries and a haunting presence that refused to be forgotten. Olivia, a gifted artist yearning for inspiration, had stumbled upon Willowbrook Cottage during a weekend getaway. Its isolated location and idyllic surroundings had drawn her in, promising solitude and the freedom to create. She had decided to spend a month there alone, hoping the cottage would breathe life into her art. Olivia arrived at Willowbrook Cottage on a sunny afternoon, her car navigating a narrow, winding road that led to the cottage's hidden enclave. The sight that greeted her was like something out of a storybook: wildflowers dancing in the breeze, a babbling brook nearby, and the charming cottage perched on the edge of a lush meadow. As she crossed the threshold, Olivia was captivated by the cottage's cozy interior. Wooden beams crisscrossed the low ceiling, and sunlight filtered through small, leaded windows. A sense of tranquility washed over her as she unpacked her art supplies, eager to begin her creative retreat. But as the daylight waned and shadows stretched across the cottage, Olivia couldn't ignore a growing unease. The isolation that had beckoned her here now felt like a weight on her chest, and the silence seemed to echo with something more, something unsettling. Olivia's days were spent immersed in her art, capturing the beauty of the meadows and the serene forest that surrounded Willowbrook Cottage. The trees rustled with secrets, and the brook murmured ancient tales. But as night descended upon the cottage, a sense of disquiet settled in. She heard strange noises, the whisper of leaves against the windows, faint footsteps in the hallway, and a haunting, melancholic melody that seemed to drift through the air. Olivia dismissed them as the quirks of an old cottage and her overactive imagination. One evening, as Olivia painted by candlelight, the room grew unnaturally cold. She shivered as a draft rustled her sketches, and a whisper, faint but distinct, filled the room. It was a voice, a woman's voice, speaking words that Olivia couldn't quite decipher. Terrified, Olivia extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. But the voice continued to speak, its words echoing in her mind. She fled to her bedroom and locked the door, trembling as she tried to make sense of the inexplicable. The inexplicable events within Willowbrook Cottage only intensified. Olivia's nights became restless, plagued by vivid nightmares and the feeling of being watched. She noticed paintings moving of their own accord, and her sketches were marred by eerie, ghostly figures that appeared on the canvas. Olivia began to hear voices in the dead of night, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. They spoke of sorrow, betrayal, and a malevolent presence that dwelled within Willowbrook Cottage. Terrified, she sought answers in the cottage's history, uncovering tales of a tragic love affair that had ended in despair. Led her to a small, dimly lit room, where a spectral figure stood at a grand piano. It was a woman in a tattered, white gown, her fingers gliding gracefully over the keys. She turned to Olivia, her eyes vacant and filled with sadness. Olivia tried to communicate with her, but the woman remained silent, lost in her haunting melody. As Olivia continued her exploration of Willowbrook Cottage, she encountered more unexplainable phenomena. Lights flickered and dimmed inexplicably, and eerie apparitions appeared in the moonlit corridors. The whispers that had haunted her grew more distinct, as if a chorus of unseen voices surrounded her. She delved deeper into the cottage's history, uncovering the tragic tale of Eliza, a woman who had been torn apart by a forbidden love. It was said that her spirit still lingered within Willowbrook Cottage, trapped by her unfulfilled desires and the malevolent force that bound her. Olivia's nights grew increasingly tumultuous as she struggled to understand the darkness that enveloped the cottage. She realized that she was not alone. Eliza's tormented spirit, and the malevolent entity that held her captive, sought to draw her into their tragic story. Determined to confront the malevolent entity and free herself from the grip of Willowbrook Cottage, Olivia ventured into the heart of the cottage. She called out to Eliza, acknowledging her pain and the forbidden love that had bound her spirit. One fateful night, as Olivia stood in the dimly lit room, the malevolent presence manifested before her, an ethereal figure shrouded in darkness. It spoke through her, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the cottage. It revealed its name, Lucian, and its insatiable hunger for souls. Olivia, her resolve unshaken, refused to yield to Lucian's malevolence. With a fierce determination, she challenged the entity, demanding that it release Eliza's spirit and free Willowbrook Cottage from its dark influence. The walls seemed to tremble, and the air crackled with an otherworldly energy. A battle of wills unfolded within Willowbrook Cottage, a clash between the malevolent force of Lucian and the strength of Olivia's determination. The very foundation of the cottage seemed to quake, and the shadows that had haunted her retreated. With a final, defiant cry, Olivia banished Lucian from the cottage, her voice resonating with power. The entity screamed in anguish as it was forced to release Eliza's spirit, and the cottage itself seemed to sigh with relief. With the malevolent force banished, Olivia emerged from Willowbrook Cottage, her heart heavy with the weight of the past. She knew that the cottage would forever bear the scars of its history, but perhaps, with Lucian gone, it could find a measure of redemption. As she looked back at Willowbrook Cottage one last time, Olivia saw a faint glimmer of light within its darkened windows. It was as though the cottage itself acknowledged her efforts and offered a silent gratitude for the release from its haunted legacy. Are you new to this channel? Make sure to subscribe for more videos like this.